Howdy, everybody. Well, thankfully, summer is just about over here in Texas, which means that so long as it's between the hours of 4 a.m. and 6 a.m., it's safe for children to go outside again. That's great news. Hell, it's been so hot this summer, our chickens were using oven mitts to pull worms out of the ground. We've been using our seatbelt buckles for branding irons. One day back in August, it was so hot in the shade, I decided to just stay in the sun. But I digress. We actually have another hot topic that needs to be addressed. Are we in a recession? Now, y'all probably saw all the headlines after the last announcement of inflation-adjusted GDP showing that it had shrunk for 2 consecutive quarters. People started shouting that this was the definition of a recession and we must be in one. Meanwhile, the White House did its best to divert attention from this news and try to get folks to focus on variables like unemployment. How can this be a recession, they said, with such low unemployment? Who's right? Are we in a recession or not? Well, let me ask you this. Is Pluto a planet? Well, from 1930 to 2006, the answer would have been yes. But in 2006, the International Astronomical Union redefined the term planet so as to exclude Pluto. Sounds a little bit like what happened to me down at the Elks Lodge, but that's all water under the bridge now. Didn't want to be a member anyway. So, Pluto is now what they call a dwarf planet. Seems a little politically incorrect to me, but there you have it. So since the International Astronomical Union is in charge of making up the definitions, and if that's what they decide, that's the end of it. Pluto is no longer a planet because the IAU is in charge of saying what a planet is. Well, this raises the question, I wonder who's in charge in the United States of America, God's country, of making up the definition of recession, right? Well, a lot of people think that it is that 2 consecutive quarterly declines in real GDP. You know who made that up? A feller named Julius Shiskin back in 1974. He wrote a piece for the New York Times listing some things to look for in terms of spotting a recession. One of those things, just one mind you, was that 2 consecutive quarterly declines in real GDP. It was the only one that really caught on, and we still remember it today. So, since Julius Shiskin is in charge of defining recessions, we must be in one. Except that he's not. The equivalent of the International Astronomical Union, as far as recessions go, is the National Bureau of Economic Research. They are an independent think tank, not part of the government, and they are the only recognized authority on the matter. They get to make up the definition, all right? And here's what they say. I got it all writ out right here. I got their definition. Let's see. The NBER, this is straight from the horse's mouth. The NBER's definition emphasizes that a recession involves a significant decline in economic activity that is spread across the economy and lasts more than a few months. In our interpretation of this definition, we treat the 3 criteria, depth, diffusion, and duration, I bet they call them the 3 Ds around the office, as somewhat interchangeable. That is, while each criterion needs to be met individually to some degree, extreme conditions revealed by one criterion may be partially offset by weaker indications from another. For example, I always like when they give an example. For example, in the case of the February 2020 peak in economic activity, the committee concluded that the subsequent drop in activity had been so great and so widely diffused throughout the economy that even though it proved to be quite brief, it should be called a recession. Let's see, another paragraph here and then I'll stop. Because, again, this is from the NBER, the essential equivalent of the IAU of recessions. Because a recession must influence the economy broadly and not be confined to one sector, the committee, it's a committee that decides whether or not there's a recession, emphasizes economy-wide measures of economic activity. The determination of the months of peaks and troughs is based on a range of monthly measures of aggregate real economic activity, yada, yada, yada. These include, and they go on to a list of all the things they look at. There ain't no fixed rule about what measures contribute information to the process or how they are weighted in our decisions. In recent decades, the 2 measures we have put the most weight on are personal income less transfers and non-farm payroll employment. So there you have it. In reality, whether or not there's a recession is a judgment call. Kind of like whether or not somebody's ugly, right? I mean, they got their three criterion that they're going to use: depth, diffusion, and duration. And if one of them is not so evident, but the other ones are, especially so, then they can call it a recession. Think of it this way. Imagine we had three guidelines for somebody being considered ugly, like a waistline like Donald Trump's, a haircut like Steve Bannon's, and anything like Rudy Giuliani. So then take Stephen Miller. Now, he doesn't have Trump's waistline or Bannon's haircut, but he's sort of like a more evil and sadistic Rudy Giuliani. So I declare him ugly, right? I'd be allowed to do that. Because the way they do it is they put together a committee, they kind of think about stuff. I don't know, what do you think, Bob? I don't know, Susan, do you think it's a recession? Well, I don't know, but I do know that Rudy Giuliani's ugly right along with Stephen Miller. And then they decide whether or not there's been a recession, right? So they lay out, and they and only they are allowed to say whether or not we're in a recession. So are we? Well, it's not for me to say. They haven't decided yet. But you know what? In any event, it makes as much practical difference to decide whether or not we're in recession or not as whether or not we call Pluto a planet or a dwarf planet. A day on Pluto is 153 hours, whether it's a planet or not. It still takes Pluto 248 years to orbit the Sun, whether it's a planet or not. The average temperature on Pluto is still negative 380 degrees Fahrenheit, which would feel awful good here, whether it's a planet or not. Now, I don't mean to say the definitions are unimportant, but what I do mean to say, however, is that arguing over whether or not we're in a recession does not change in the least the actual conditions in our economy. Whether we're in recession or not, we still face potentially catastrophic problems from climate change, serious income distribution problems, the worst healthcare system in the developed world, crumbling infrastructure, the highest poverty rate of any developed nation, and a central bank that thinks that you can solve inflation caused by COVID and a European war by just making sure that Americans have fewer jobs. So going back to Stephen Miller, it's like whether we declare him ugly or not really isn't the key issue. I mean, he could look like George Clooney, and I still don't want to sit next to him on a long flight. Thank you very much. See you next time.